As we said when this segment was first broadcast last December, this will surprise you. 2 or 3 out of every 10 gas stations in this country are leaking gasoline into the ground, possibly into your drinking water. That, according to a consultant for the petroleum industry itself. Is it serious? The EPA says it could be the major pollution problem of the 80s because the pollutants leaking into your drinking water from defective underground tanks and pipes are known to cause cancer and other health problems. Not all gas stations are leaking, but too many of them are. We're right by an American institution, the neighborhood service station. If you're 50 or so, you may have had your first job in a place like that. If you're a Norman Rockwell American, you probably knew the owner and asked him everything about your car. You probably didn't ask him if he had buried a time bomb in your neighborhood. We have a case in point, 2 service stations in a small town in Rhode Island. The Environmental Protection Agency says a time bomb exploded here in the form of underground leaks from these stations, mingling with groundwater and ending up in the wells of these pleasant homes a few hundred yards downhill.
There were many people that thought that we were off our rocker, that we were imagining this, that it wasn't so. But you can't be imagining it when the Department of Health tells you that it is there and you cannot use your water, tells you don't use it for cooking or drinking. It's not.
Joyce Pendleton discovered gasoline in her water 14 years ago. Soon 4 other families in this southern Rhode Island neighborhood had the same problem. The contamination spread slowly in Kanawha Park, and by 1979, 8 of the 40 families had gasoline. The community became alarmed, as there was no way to predict whose well would be next. When Jerome Hatfield moved into Kanawha Park, his water was fine for over 3 years.
My oldest daughter was in taking a shower, and she kept telling me that she had a very funny odor. She just kept telling us, Daddy, it just doesn't smell right. They took tests of our water shortly after, I think it's about 2 to 3 months after. And we turned up that we had gasoline in our water then.
When the residents of Kanawha Park first found gasoline in their water, they assumed it was coming from this mobile station about a quarter of a mile away. The station had reported a possible leak shortly after it opened. The local fire chief, Fred Stanley, was called in to investigate.
I went up and sampled the water, and the water at the station, the drinking water, was almost ignitable at the time. There was so much gas in it, and I notified the attendant to contact the mobile company, and I would like to have someone down immediately to run a test on the tanks.
Chief Stanley says Mobile did send an engineer who acknowledged there was a leak. Then Stanley turned the problem over to the local town council. The town council, in spite of its concern, took no action against the mobile station. It's been suggested the town council could have closed that station until the situation was corrected. Could it have?
We were told at the time we could not.
Herbert Arnold was president of the town council at that time.
It was brought to our attention pretty loud and clear that an oil company the size of Mobil had resources to successfully counteract anything that we might put up.
That's a pretty startling thing to say, isn't it?
Isn't it?
You're saying that the town council was helpless in the face of a major oil company.
Right.
What does Mobil say about all this? Bob Weeks, an executive vice president for the Mobil Corporation, says Mobil did not have a leak at that station.
We have had no history of a leak at that station. We've had a couple instances where the dealer thinks he's lost some product. In both those cases, we tested the station. We dug up the station. So the hydrocarbon that is in the water aquifer at these 15 families in Kanawha Park, I don't think is Mobil hydrocarbon.
Although Mobil acknowledged no legal responsibility, it agreed to put in 4 new wells. Joyce Pendleton says her new well water was wonderful, but a year later the gasoline was back. For the next 10 years, the residents were on their own. They wrote letters and were shuttled from agency to agency. And all this time, they had to find their own water. Meanwhile, during that 10 years of frustrations, where did you get your water?
We had been going from neighbors, friends, relatives, and lugging our water in milk bottle jugs, the plastic jugs.
Down the street, the Hatfields, a young family with 3 daughters, have special problems.
My oldest one plays basketball, and when she comes home, she can't jump in the shower. I have to heat water, and she has to take a sponge bath. And I run into Wesley to my mother's about 3 times a week, so the girls can have baths, and my husband and myself. And it's just a big inconvenience. We have to work around taking showers.
That's true.
The residents banded together and hired lawyer Mark Schoberg, who filed a $100 million suit in their behalf.
The old idea that your home is your castle is right out the window.
They can't sell their homes, can they?
They can't sell them, no. Banks have turned down mortgage applications for the homes. So essentially, by taking away the ability to sell your home, you have most people's major investment tied up. They can't move on. They're prisoners there, and they're camping in their own homes.
Is Kanab Park an isolated case? We spoke with Warren Rogers, a consultant on leaking tanks for the American Petroleum Institute.
Well, it's a very large, very complex problem. To illustrate, the major oil companies currently are spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars trying to correct this problem.
Rogers says he hears of new leaks every week, and that 75,000 tanks may be leaking right now, not only at gas stations, but at factories, farms, police stations around the country. He thinks the neighborhood gas station may be a third of the total problem.
How can 12,000 mobile systems that in the last 2 years have had 1 tank leak that didn't get off the premises, a handful of line leaks, only one of which got off the premises, didn't threaten drinking water, was repaired immediately, how can that consultant be accurate when he says such a high percentage of present-day systems fail? Human error is going to happen. Except for that, we don't have any errors. We don't have any leaks in tanks. The other companies can't be that different. They can't be that sloppy. And again, it's to nobody's advantage to have hydrocarbon outside the system. I don't think the problem is anywhere near this big.
If I went out to a random 10 stations, how many of the 10 would have a problem?
Well, assuming we selected at random, and assuming it was a good random sample, 2 to 3.
For the residents in Kanab Park, help was slow in coming. They asked the state for assistance, but Rhode Island had no jurisdiction over groundwater at the time. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency was called in to investigate. When the year-long investigation was complete, EPA flatly blamed not only Mobil, but also the Exxon station across the street for the pollution. Did you have a leak there?
We don't believe our station is responsible for the gasoline components in the underground water at Kanab Park.
Ed Hess is a senior vice president for the Exxon Corporation. You did report a leak or a problem there in 1979, didn't you?
In 1979, we had a hole in 1 tank. At that time, the evidence indicates that rather than gasoline going out into the water table was high and water came into the tank. As a result, we don't think we lost any gasoline. And when we dug the tanks out, we examined the spot underneath where that hole was and found no evidence that gasoline had escaped from that hole.
After announcing its findings in 1982, EPA issued an administrative order early in 1983. Al Lam is Deputy Administrator for the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Your administrative order went out to Mobil and to Exxon.
And that order specifically requires them to provide bottled water in the interim and to take steps to clean up the water supply.
Those bottled water deliveries created a new set of problems for some of the residents, particularly for Mr. and Mrs. Hall, who are retired. They can't lift the heavy water bottles. Just washing dishes is a major ordeal.
I think it is unfair for a person my age to reach this age and then have this to contend with. It's just a little bit too much for me. It's too much pressure. It's affecting our marriage. I mean, we can't talk civilized sometimes because you're irritable. You're not feeling well, for one thing. And you certainly don't feel satisfied with the way situations are going.
The residents also worry about future health effects caused by their exposure to gasoline. Barbara Pepler is Joyce's next-door neighbor.
Well, sometimes I could cry. I get so mad and so frustrated about the whole thing that I could really, really cry. I also wake up many nights thinking about my youngest son, whom I carried and drank the water, and he has learning disabilities. And I wonder if I'm guilty of doing this to him because I did drink the water. And it's a big worry.
The long-term health problems may be the biggest worry, but it's the day-in, day-out mechanics of living that drive the residents up the wall. Here is Joyce Pendleton washing her face. Take water from 50-pound cooler, heat it, pour into otherwise useless lavatory, wash face. It would be tempting sometimes, after 14 years, to stay dirty. Although Mobil thinks the situation in Kanab Park is an isolated case, Exxon is less sure. With twice as many systems as Mobil, Exxon says in the past year it has found about 2% of its tanks or pipes leaking. That's over 500 leaks in Exxon stations alone. And Ed Hess says Exxon has already spent a lot of money to get the problem under control.
Harry, we're very concerned about the problem. Fortunately, in our experience, the numbers of times that an individual may be inconvenienced by a leak from an underground gasoline storage tank is relatively rare. We have already spent, since 1979, $100 million in Exxon to upgrade or replace tanks. We're continuing our program. We will have upgraded or replaced 100% of our underground tanks by the year 1986 at a total cost that we now estimate of $170 million.
Bob Weeks says Mobil has had a good record in keeping its tanks leak-proof.
We have about 8,000 steel tanks, all but a handful of which are quite young, and we have 4,000 fiberglass tanks, which is the new tank system that we're installing. And the fiberglass system, for all practical purposes, is forever.
The quickest and best solution for Kanab Park, everyone seems to agree, is a new piped-in water system. That would avoid one other argument. The oil companies say that because of other contaminants, Kanab Park's water wouldn't be drinkable even with the gasoline removed, although EPA disagrees. Mobil and Exxon are willing to share the cost of a new water system with the state, if a satisfactory answer to the $100 million suit against them by the residents can be worked out. And to further complicate the solution, while we were filming this story, that same Mobil station discovered and reported a leak.
The station was closed by order of the fire chief as of yesterday afternoon. They found free gasoline floating on the water in the bottom of the hole, on the water table.
Malcolm Grant works for Rhode Island's Environmental Agency. He says the leak was not in the tanks, it was in the pipes leading from the tanks. Several hundred gallons of gasoline have already been recovered, and no one knows how long it was leaking or if it has gotten into the groundwater. The station remains closed while testing and recovery continue. There's some good news for the residents of Kanab Park. The oil companies agreed to split the cost of a new water system with the state while the lawsuit is pending. Work on the new system began in July, and water is scheduled to enter the residents' homes by September. Meanwhile, the families with gasoline in their water continue to use bottled water provided by the oil companies. And the Mobile station has reopened for business.